Высота 8500. Перехват немедленно.
Роза 19 экземпляров.
Exactly 2 months to the day after Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 high-altitude spy plane were shot down over Russia in May of 1960. A second and lesser-known incident occurred high above the Arctic Circle on the fringes of Soviet territory. A Strategic Air Command RB-47 reconnaissance aircraft was performing an electronic intelligence mission when it was intercepted and shot down by Soviet MiG-19 fighter aircraft, resulting in the capture of 2 American airmen and the deaths of 4 others. This documentary, filled with historic detail and recreated scenes, is the story of the 1960 Kola Shootdown. At the edge of the Soviet Arctic, where the Barents Sea meets a bleak, desolate and wind-scoured coastline, lies the Kola Peninsula and one of the largest concentrations of Soviet deterrence during the Cold War. By 1960, the USSR knew that in the event of nuclear war, survival would depend on a second strike capability, being able to hit back even after the homeland had been reduced to ash. That retaliation would come not from the air or land, but from the sea. With direct access to the Barents Sea and the Atlantic Ocean beyond, Kola became the home of the Northern Fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Soviet Union. Concentrated around the Murmansk region, hidden among the inlets and fjords were submarine pens, missile bunkers, naval airfields, radar early warning facilities, and deep water shipyards. Severomorsk, just to the northeast of Murmansk, was a closed city, and only those with permission could live there. It became the headquarters and operational nucleus of the Northern Fleet and Arctic defence, where cruisers and destroyers such as the Sverdlov and Kotland class loomed in port. Three nearby airfields, Severomorsk 1, 2 and 3, hosted anti-submarine and reconnaissance aircraft. Seen here are scores of Tu-16 and Tu-95 aircraft sitting out in the open. Polyani and Alinya Guba to the northwest were both home to Golf-class diesel-electric ballistic missile submarines in the historic shipyard No. 10, which was modified for refit and repair. If we zoom in, we can see many submarines docked here. Kojevo, nestled deep within Sada Bay, emerged in the late 1950s as the operational hub for the USSR's first generation of nuclear-powered submarines. From its icy piers, November-class attack subs and the Hotel-class ballistic missile boats armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes and the R-13 strategic missile were prepared for Cold War patrols into the Barents and beyond. To the south here, Alanya Air Base, with its 3,300 metre runway, was one of the longest in the USSR. Tupolev 16 Badger bombers were ready to ultimately deliver atomic payloads across the North Pole to American targets. Naturally, NATO war planners placed the Kola Peninsula among the highest priority strategic targets. Decapitating the head of the Northern Fleet and preventing a breakout into the North Atlantic was deemed essential by the West, and the Soviets knew it. Therefore, a massive portion of national resources were dedicated to defending the area. Fighter aviation regiments stationed at airfields like Kilp-Yavr fielded the supersonic MiG-19 fighter on scramble alert, providing air cover and intercept capability. Just 30 kilometres northwest of Murmansk, Kilp-Yavr was home to the 174th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment and will be important to this story. Aircraft sit armed and fuelled on standby, waiting for the call. At least 23 S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile batteries ringed key installations. Their fan-song radars pointed outwards, and telephone pole-sized missiles at the ready to reach out 45 kilometres and obliterate any intruder. You can still see the remnants of some of these now defunct sites today. From the perspective of the United States and their allies, it was deemed essential to survey these sites, document radar signature capabilities, and collect intelligence on the configuration and composition of air defence forces on Kola. Overflights at 70,000 feet from photographic reconnaissance aircraft, such as the U-2 spy plane, could only provide part of the picture. Electronic intelligence, or ELINT, missions were designed to identify and characterise every emitter in Soviet territory: radars, missile guidance systems, communications and telemetry transmissions. The objective was to capture parameters like frequency, pulse repetition rate, scan patterns and emitter locations. Such data defined capabilities of radar and helped map out Soviet air defence systems across zones like the Kola Peninsula. In order to perform the task known as ferret missions, specialised aircraft such as the modified RB-47H Stratojet would skirt along the very edge of hostile territory, attempting to provoke target tracks from Soviet radar installations. Specialised equipment on these aircraft would then record the waveforms and other data to reverse engineer and analyse the capabilities and coverage. This information would go on to aid in the development of electronic countermeasures, or ECM, to jam and confuse Soviet radar systems. It would guide the development of stealth technology such as shaping, coatings and radar cross-section within state-of-the-art and secretive programs such as the CIA's Oxcart and the later SR-71 Blackbird for the Air Force. Knowing where and how radar coverage was organised allowed US defence strategists to develop bomber attack routes to minimise or avoid possible radar detection and interception by enemy forces. In summary, ELINT flights in the 1960s reduced the uncertainty about Soviet air defence, missile and naval radar capabilities. Ultimately, even though the United States eventually transitioned to satellite reconnaissance and unmanned platforms, the lessons learnt from ELINT missions defined much of the early Cold War's electronic warfare doctrine. The Boeing B-47 Stratojet emerged from America's post-war race to master jet-powered bombing. Sleek, six-engined and swept-wing, it could outrun most fighters of the early 1950s and became the backbone of Strategic Air Command, the edge of the United States nuclear deterrent. More than 2,000 were built, standing alert on runways from England to Guam. But brute force alone couldn't win a future war. To penetrate the expanding Soviet air defence network, the United States needed intelligence. Boeing's proven airframe provided the ideal foundation. The company stripped out the bombing equipment, replaced it with racks of receivers, analysers and recording gear, and turned the bomber into a spy platform. Thus was born the RB-47 and its most advanced variant, the RB-47H, purpose-built for electronic reconnaissance. From the outside, the RB-47 looked very much like the standard B-47, with a few notable differences. The nose was lengthened and bombardier equipment removed to accommodate a radar detector, giving an overall length of 32.9 metres. With a huge wingspan of 35.4 metres, the RB-47 had a formidable profile and tremendous ramp appeal in my opinion. To reduce drag, the wings were exceptionally thin with a high sweep angle, flexing up to 5.1 metres at the tips during manoeuvres. New engineering techniques needed to be developed to effectively strengthen the wing. Large control surfaces provided excellent roll characteristics for such a large airframe, reported as handling much closer to a fighter jet. The landing gear was unique, a bicycle-style fore and aft with small outriggers in the inboard engine nacelles for stability. Many design characteristics would be retained by Boeing in the legendary successor aircraft, the B-52 Stratofortress. Powered by the General Electric J47 turbojet engines that put out 7,200 pounds of thrust each, the plane could cruise at 572 miles per hour at an altitude ceiling of 47,800 feet. GE would go on to make more of these engines than any other type in history. To increase takeoff thrust, water could be injected into the engines, but had the effect of multiplying unburned particulates, producing the iconic dirty smoke plumes often seen in this era. These early generation engines were also heavy on the fuel burn, with a typical endurance of between 3,000 and 4,000 miles, necessitating the need for in-flight refueling during long missions. Like its bomber cousin, solid-fueled rocket engines for rocket-assisted takeoff, or RATO, could be strapped to the fuselage to quickly get aircraft at or above maximum takeoff weight off the ground if necessary. For defence, two radar-assisted 20mm cannons were located in the tail and controlled remotely by the co-pilot, whose seat could swivel to face backwards. Provided mostly as a design afterthought in the 1950s, given the expectation of flying higher and faster than any interceptor at the time. Up top, the pilot and co-pilot sat in a tandem, fighter-style bubble canopy, offering good all-round visibility, but limiting crew coordination. The cockpit is laid out as shown here. The co-pilot had repeated flight controls and instruments in the back with the addition of the gunnery station. A navigator was housed below and forward in the nose of the aircraft. All crew would get into the jet via a small belly access hatch and ladder. These blisters on the fuselage and wings contained sensitive radar and electronic surveillance receivers. Cameras could also be fitted depending on the mission. To operate the new equipment, 3 electronic warfare officers, known as the Ravens, were needed, bringing the original crew from 3 up to 6. They would be housed within a cramped and windowless pressurised capsule known as the Raven Pod in the former bomb bay of the B-47 shown here. After takeoff, the 3 Ravens would crawl down a narrow access shaft into the pod and strap themselves in. In the event of an emergency, each crew member was sitting on an ejection seat. The pilot and co-pilot had upward ejecting seats, while both the navigator and Ravens ejected downwards, punching through the bottom of the pod and the aircraft. Crews did not hold much faith in these downward seats. They had proven unreliable and hazardous. Odds were that in an ejection, you were just as likely to be decapitated by the seat than for it to save your life. Rolling off Boeing's Wichita production line in 1955, a total of 35 advanced RB-47Hs were produced. Assigned to the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, based out of Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas, the squadron often deployed abroad to bases such as RAF Brize Norton in the UK for missions across Europe. Whilst the RB-47 is often overshadowed by the U-2 or SR-71 in popular history, it was a trailblazer, carrying out some of the most daring and unsung missions of the early Cold War. From the Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau comes the MiG-19, known simply by the West as the Farmer. It is a single-seat, twin-engine supersonic interceptor introduced in 1955 with the S model as the definitive day fighter variant of the MiG-19 series. Whilst overshadowed by the more infamous MiG-17 and MiG-21, the Farmer was a pivotal aircraft in the evolution of Soviet air defence during the late 1950s. It was the first Soviet production aircraft capable of sustained supersonic speed in level flight and could push upwards of Mach 1.2 during a fast intercept. The MiG-19's design reflected 1950s advances in aerodynamics and engine technology intended to counter high-altitude Western nuclear bombers. Its origins lay in a 1951 Soviet requirement for a fighter that could outclimb and outrun the new generation of US jet-powered bombers such as the B-47. The design bureau at Mikoyan and Gurevich responded with a clean sheet prototype, the SM-2, that would evolve into the MiG-19. Early production aircraft suffered from serious handling and reliability issues, but by the time the S model, as depicted here, entered service, many of these teething troubles had been addressed. The wing was mid-mounted with a high sweep angle of 55 degrees, improving transonic performance and reducing drag. Distinctive wing fences along the top surface control perpendicular airflow and improve stability at high angles of attack. An all-moving tailplane improved pitch control at high speeds compared to aircraft with conventional elevators. The MiG-19 had a robust tricycle-style landing gear arrangement, suitable for operation out of rougher airfields on the frontiers of Soviet territory. 3 air brakes on the fuselage could be deployed like so to control airspeed. Large flaps provided increased lift at low speeds, such as during landing or a dogfight. Finally, the MiG had a high landing speed, so a braking parachute would be used to reduce wear on the wheel brakes and landing distance. Overall, it was a compact fighter, measuring 12.5 metres in length, 9 metres in wingspan, and standing 3.8 metres tall. Jammed between the iconic nose intake inherent in early generation MiG aircraft was neither a spacious nor ergonomic cockpit. Critical control systems are outlined as shown here. 2 Tomansky RD-9B afterburning turbojet engines, pumping out 7,000 pounds of thrust each, gave the 7.5-tonne jet impressive acceleration for its day. A consequence, however, was a heavy fuel burn. With only 1.5 tonnes of fuel on board, around 1,800 litres. At full afterburner, the plane would be running low on fuel in just 8 minutes. To extend the range, typical configurations would always include these 2 760-litre external drop tanks under the wings. Armed with 3 massive Nudelman Richter 30mm autocannons and coupled with the ASP-5 radar-ranging gun sight, this MiG was the last of the true Soviet gunfighters. These are some reference cartridges in typical calibers for the era. And this is a Soviet 30mm high explosive armour-piercing cannon round. Just a handful of these 400-gram projectiles hitting a target was enough to get the job done in most cases. The jet would typically carry 205 of these shells and could blow through the entire belt in just 4.7 seconds of continuous fire at 900 rounds per minute for each gun. Fitted with huge muzzle brakes and mounted in the wing roots and nose of the aircraft as shown here, special flashing panels were installed to protect the skin from the significant muzzle blast. The MiG-19's combination of twin engines, thin swept wings, all-flying tail and heavy cannon armament made it a formidable interceptor for its day. Its design prioritised climb rate and raw speed to tackle high-flying intruders, within the limits of 1950s technology. Built under licence in China and designated the J6, it would go on to fight in many conflicts around the world, most famously in Vietnam, where North Vietnamese pilots engaged US F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs in close-range cannon duels, as well as the Middle East, the Indo-Pakistani Wars and numerous African conflicts. Though quickly eclipsed by the Mach 2 capable MiG-21, the MiG-19 proved that the Soviet Union could field a truly supersonic fighter, and it set the template for the interceptors that followed. July 1st, 1960. A Strategic Air Command tasking order had come through earlier that day, codenamed Boston Casper. An RB-47H tail number 4281 from the 38th Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron was to conduct a standard ELINT patrol over the Barents Sea. The flight plan would see the crew take off from RAF Brize Norton in the UK, track northeast along the Norwegian coast and rendezvous with a new 4-engined KC-135A tanker aircraft to top off the fuel. From there, the RB-47 would track northeast prior to beginning their ELINT run in a triangular pattern 50 nautical miles off the coast of the Kola Peninsula over international waters. Total mission time would be approximately 12 hours. The crew for this mission was Pilot Major Willard G. Palm, Co-Pilot Captain Freeman Bruce Olmsted, Navigator Captain John R. McCone, and 3 electronic warfare officers, Major Eugene Poser, Captain Dean Phillips, and Captain Oscar Goforth. At around 1000 hours Zulu time, the 6 men arrive in jeeps alongside their RB-47 sitting on the tarmac in the warm sun. It's a fine day for flying and the weather is clear. Following boarding, Captain Palm gives the signal for ground power.
Chief Combs check, how do you hear me? Loud and clear. Pins out, covers off, external power hot. Ready when you are. Bruce, get on the horn and let's get going. Rise ground, Raven 2-3, request start.
Raven 2-3, Brize ground, startup approved. QNH 1020, surface con, runway in use 08.
Major Palm flicks the boost pumps and engine master switches to the on position before thumbing the ignition button for each engine in sequence. The 6 J-47s wind to life one by one.
Engine temperatures rising. Oil pressures look good. Engine RPM nominal.
The crew, having completed their taxi and takeoff checklists, were ready.
6 engines lit. You're ready to go. Rise ground, Raven 2-3. 6 running. Ready taxi IFR northbound.
Raven 2-3, Brize ground, correction. Runway now east 26, traffic sequence. Taxi via 7 to holding point 26, hold short.
Taxi 7, hold short. 2-6, Raven 2-3. Chief shocks. Shocks removed. Sean, confirming rendezvous with KC-135, Sector Bravo. Affirmative. Flight plans got us 12:30 Zulu. About 2 hours transit.
Raven 2-3, contact tower 125.723.
125.723, Raven 2-3. Tower Raven 2-3, holding short 2-6. Raven 2-3, winds 240 at 4. Cleared for takeoff 2-6. Takeoff, Raven 2-3.
Lined up and ready, Willard Palm advances the 6 thrust levers forward as far as they will go. The J-47 scream to life and the heavy RB-47 starts the takeoff roll.
Power set. Speed alive, temps nominal. 100. 120. 150. Rotate.
At 150 knots, the jet lifts off 5,500 feet down the 9,000 foot long runway. Around 20 minutes later, they had completed their climb to 28,000 feet and levelled out ready for the 2-hour transit over Scotland and the Norwegian Sea to the rendezvous with the KC-135, which would be flying 150 nautical miles off Norway's northern extent. In the meantime, the 3 Ravens, Poser, Phillips and Goforth, who had been sitting on the floor next to the co-pilot position, crawl their way into the Raven pod via the access tunnel and strap in. At around 12:30 Zulu time, and with the Norwegian towns of Bodo and Tromsø on the horizon off the right wing, the RB-47 forms up on the KC-135.
Spade 3-1, Raven 2-3, Angels 28, 2 minutes to the ARCP. Raven 2-3, Spade 3-1, orbit established sector Bravo, flight level 300, left-hand pattern, stay visual. Copy, we see you. We're at Angels 2A, closing. Contact, Raven 2-3. Good flow. Gauge is coming up.
25 tonnes of JP-4 jet fuel transferred between the 2 aircraft will take a little over 10 minutes. During this time, Palm has to precision fly the huge aircraft with constant focus.
Passing 28,000 transferred. Flow steady. 5,000 pounds per minute. Roger. Raven 2-3. 5,000 transferred. Disconnect in 3, 2, 1. Disconnect complete. Disconnected, Raven 2-3. Transfer complete. Cleared mission track northeast. Godspeed.
At around 13:30 Zulu, the plane had reached the start of the ELINT run, where it would make a turn to a southeast heading for 150 nautical miles before tracking east, paralleling the Kola Peninsula coastline. The Ravens switch on their monitoring equipment and begin listening for Soviet radar signals. The Soviets, however, could see them coming. Before the RB-47 had even commenced its ELINT waypoint turn towards Kola, P-14 Tall King VHF or P-35 Barlock L-band early warning radars, likely at Olenogorsk or Severomorsk, were tracking an unknown bomber-sized bogey with no IFF response. Data was collected over the next 30 minutes and relayed to a GCI command station. At around 14:30 Zulu, When the target was not altering course away from the peninsula, a scramble order was initiated. Over at Kilp-Yavr Air Base, Captain Vasily Polyakov was standing nearby his fully armed and fueled MiG-19 fighter on a 5-minute strip alert status. Suddenly, a klaxon sounds and an intercept vector is being communicated over the radio to his cockpit. He races up the ladder and begins the startup procedure.
Ты меня слышишь?
Утвердительный.
Начиная 1. Начиная 2. Хороший запуск. Номинальные обороты. Стабильная температура.
He is cleared for an immediate departure. It's only taken 4 minutes since the first siren until Vasily and his wingmen roar into the skies over Kilp-Yavr.
Роза 19-26. Воздушно-десантные.
As the MiG had no onboard search radar, once airborne, the GIC was continuously updating the bogey's heading and speed to Vasily as he corrected the intercept vector. A high-speed zoom climb and intercept would only take 12 minutes from takeoff to cover the 130 nautical miles.
Целевой курс 123, дальность 80 километров, высота 8500, целевая скорость 830.
At around 4,500 metres, he punches the external tank jettison button and ditches the two 760-litre tanks that were adding extra drag.
Форсаж.
Pushing the throttle all the way from military power to the afterburner stops, the two MiGs smash their way through the sound barrier and go supersonic. Back on the Stratojet, the crew are continuing with their mission, unaware of the rapidly closing Soviet fighters. Co-pilot Olmsted is the first to notice what looks to be the contrails of an aircraft making a beam pass at 90 degrees in front of them. Olmsted would later recount that this didn't necessarily alarm the crew. They were over international waters, and from their perspective, it was likely the aircraft was just monitoring their position. As they approach the final steer point, 50 miles off Cape Holy Nose, Navigator McCone notes his chronometer reads 14:57 Zulu. In 3 minutes, they need to bank hard left to return towards Norway. Polyakov could see the speck of the RB-47 growing in front of him now, and visually confirmed to the ground controllers the nature of the threat. With his wingman already moving to a high cover position, he manoeuvres the MiG level with the target.
Цель визуальная. Подтверждаю. Это американский разведывательный самолет. Я рядом, крыльями трясу.
He would later recount that he attempted to communicate to the Americans by rocking his wings, a sort of a sign language that meant to follow him. However, he received no acknowledgement, and it was likely from their position the crew of the RB-47 did not even see him. Radioing this back to base, the captain was given his orders.
Цель нарушитель. Вам разрешено атаковать.
reducing speed to position himself in a rear starboard aspect. Polyakov reaches across and presses these 3 buttons, priming each of the 3 cannons.
Принято. Начинаю атаку.
He then proceeds to dial in the approximate wingspan of the RB-47 into his radar gun sight. The reticle now operating in a gyro-stabilised mode and projecting a gun ballistic solution with a calculated lead aiming point. He flies the MiG precisely to align this reticle over his target. Taking a breath, he squeezed the gun trigger, letting rip a storm of 30mm cannon. Polyakov's first firing pass was devastating. He raked the RB-47's right wing with heavy cannon shells. The plane began to enter a violent spin with Palm and Olmsted fighting for control. Amazingly, they managed to recover the stricken plane despite quickly losing hydraulic power. Polyakov wasn't done yet.
Я снова атакую.
Circling around, he unleashed a second burst of cannon fire into the port fuselage and cockpit, opening up a huge hole in the forward area. A cone up front somehow survived this barrage by sheer miracle. Major Palm knew the stricken aircraft was doomed, and so he called for the bailout over the intercom. Reaching down to pull their D-ring ejection handles, each crewman were explosively ejected from the aircraft. John McCone, the navigator, fell in free fall from 28,000 feet to 14,000 feet before his parachute opened. Dangling below the bright orange canopy, he looked around and spotted 2 other parachutes below him in the distance. Although he had no way of knowing, he believed one of the chutes to be Olmsted, and the other, one further beneath, might have been Palm. He looked limp and unmoving. The remaining 3 crew were nowhere in sight. It was possible that they hadn't escaped the B-47, or that their chutes were not observed. The abandoned aircraft had managed to miraculously right itself and would continue flying north over open ocean for about 200 miles prior to crashing. The Arctic water of the Barents was near freezing, and splashing down into it, McCone knew he was in an immediate life or death situation. Luckily, the B-47 ejection seats were equipped with a life raft and a survival kit, and after inflating it, managed to drag himself in. At the same time, somewhere out there in the 6-foot swell was Captain Olmsted, in a similar situation, having also survived the descent. He, however, was in agony following the ejection. Something in his back was broken, and he would continue to slip in and out of consciousness. The pair would drift for over 6 hours, suffering the freezing temperatures and having to constantly bail water from their dinghies, but alive nonetheless. There was no sign of the other 4 crewmen. The pair were not sure if rescue would come in the form of a friendly source or not. After some time, McCone spotted a dark shape on the horizon and begins flashing a small mirror from his survival kit to attract attention. A Russian fishing trawler materialises through the sea mist, first plucking McCone, then later Olmsted from the freezing hell. Following this ordeal, the pair were flown on July 2nd to Moscow in a Lisanov Li-2, accompanied by Soviet officers. Tragically, Major Palm was later found deceased. A Soviet ship recovered his body on July 4th. Major Pose's body was also recovered by the Soviets at some point, but never returned and ultimately buried in an unknown location in the USSR. Captain Phillips and Goforth were never found and presumed dead at sea. Polyakov and his wingman returned to Kilp-Yavr as heroes. The MiG-19 having proven itself with its first airborne kill. The shootdown of the RB-47 sparked an immediate and tense diplomatic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, coming as it did so soon after the Gary Powers U-2 incident only 2 months prior. Initially, Washington was in the dark about the crew's fate. The RB-47's disappearance was announced by the US Air Force on July 2nd, after it failed to return from its mission. The US stated that the plane had been on a routine navigational flight in international airspace and was overdue. a NATO search and rescue effort combed the Barents Sea to no success. The Soviet Union stayed conspicuously silent for over a week. This silence was likely deliberate as they decided how to handle the incident. They even went so far as to feign cooperation in the search. Soviet ships joined the international search efforts, pretending that they knew nothing, while in reality, 2 Americans sat in a Soviet interrogation cell. Finally, on July 8th, the Soviet government broke its silence. Khrushchev sent an abrupt diplomatic note to the United States confirming that a Soviet fighter had shot down an RB-47 on July 1st, near the Kola Peninsula. The Soviets charged that the American plane had committed a gross violation of the Soviet Union's frontier, intruding into Soviet airspace for espionage, and that the 2 surviving crew members would be tried as spies under Soviet law. Drawing parallels with the Gary Powers arrest and trial, political stakes were escalated. Washington categorically denied that the RB-47 had intruded on Soviet territory, insisting that it was shot down over international waters, accusing the Soviets of a lawless attack. Ambassador Harry Cabot Lodge Jr. presented the American case at an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council. He provided radar data showing the RB-47's track and final moments, noting that the plane was at no time closer than about 30 miles to Soviet land. Nikita Khrushchev in a tirade doubled down, maintaining the claims of a border violation and new provocations from the West. He stated that President Eisenhower's assurances from the Paris summit about halting spy flights were not worth a busted penny, pointing to the RB-47 as evidence of American perfidy. He would proudly boast to his people about how alert and responsive the Soviet forces were in downing the plane. However, Khrushchev's performance was less convincing on other points. He evaded giving details of where the RB-47 was actually shot down, or whether the American flyers had confessed to international espionage. Most awkward of all was the fact that the Soviet had pretended for days to help in the search effort when they knew they had shot the plane down. Throughout much of 1960, the 2 US airmen remained in Soviet custody. Despite appeals for clemency from the United Kingdom, of which the mission was flown from, Khrushchev held on to his bargaining chips. Meanwhile, the crewmen had been enduring harsh conditions. Captain Olmsted and Captain McCone were taken within days of their capture to the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the KGB's headquarters. Olmsted had suffered a crushed vertebra in his back during the injection. He received only minimal medical treatment in prison. It wasn't until a full 15 days after his capture that he was finally seen by a doctor. Soviet interrogators initially pressed them to confess that they had knowingly entered Soviet airspace on a spy mission. According to later accounts, the KGB were convinced at first that this RB-47 flight was a deliberate provocation tied to the U-2 incident, perhaps even a mission to test Soviet responses, or a feint to distract from other operations. McCone and Olmsted refused to give false confessions. They consistently maintained that they had never entered Soviet territory and were simply performing an electronics reconnaissance mission over international waters. Their steadfastness would make an impression, and over time, after many grueling interrogations and psychological ploys, the Soviet captors grew grudgingly convinced that the Americans might have been telling the truth about not intending to violate Soviet airspace. Finally, in January 1961, there was a breakthrough. The new president-elect, John F. Kennedy, was set to take office later that month. Khrushchev decided to make a gesture, whether out of genuine goodwill or to curry favour with the incoming US leadership. On January 25, 1961, the Kremlin suddenly announced that Captains Olmsted and McCone would be released. Khrushchev publicly labelled the release a goodwill towards the new president, but privately it was said that the Soviets had been assured the US would not overly publicise or celebrate the crew's return, allowing Khrushchev to save face for changing course. Indeed, Eisenhower in his final days in office had deliberately kept the public pressure low, hoping the Soviets would relent. The strategy paid off. Returning to the States and their families, both men received the Distinguished Flying Cross and other awards for their actions. Their story was later told in the book The Little Toy Dog, which captured not only the events of the shootdown, but also the ordeal of survival, interrogation, and Cold War politics that surrounded the case. Decades later, in 2004, the Air Force further honoured them with the Silver Star for their valour in captivity, once the matter had been declassified. The 4 deceased crew members did not all come home. Major Palm's body, recovered by the Soviets, was returned to the US and buried with honours on July 25, 1960. Major Eugene Poser's remains, as noted, were never returned. He was initially buried in the USSR somewhere near Murmansk without identification, and to this day the Defence Prisoner of War Agency lists him as unrecoverable. The other 2, Phillips and Goforth, were forever lost. The RB-47 shootdown over Kola remains a tribute to the courage of Cold War reconnaissance crews. These 6 men flew into harm's way armed with little more than antennas and microphones, fully aware of the risks. As an Air Force historical report later put it, both the American and Soviet militaries conducted this risky type of border surveillance during the Cold War, and it was vital, attempting through electronic instruments to ferret out communication and defence secrets of the other. The sacrifice of the 4 crewmen who died and the ordeal of the 2 survivors were not in vain. Their mission gathered intelligence that added to the West's understanding of Soviet defences, and their story added a sober lesson in the balance between bold intelligence efforts and the brink of war. The shootdown of the RB-47 over Kola thus stands as a significant episode in Cold War history. A clash of technology, will and international law at the tense margins of the superpower confrontation.